Hello and welcome to our final session of the second day of IDTX 2023. With us to round out our fantastic second day is today's end of day keynote speaker, Rick Jacobs. Rick, thanks so much for taking the time to come and share your thoughts with us. And without further ado, I'll shut up, get out the way, and the stage is yours.
Thank you. Sorry, I had some kind of weird technical thing where everything was repeating. So I apologize for my look of shock and bewilderment. So we're going to talk today about a safe place to fail. And I'm sorry.
Bear with us. Are you still getting repeating everywhere, Rick?
Okay, I think I found it. It's like having 15 different windows open, and apparently I was listening a lot to a lot of different things. So I apologize for that. We were just literally talking about technical difficulties. Everyone
Yes.
has come off fine so far. Everyone looks beautiful. It's going to be me that jacks it up. So that's so that's a really good way into segueing into scenario-based training. Had I taken the opportunity to actually start presenting and stuff and gone through the scenario, Tom and I could have spent a couple hours doing delivery of content. This is what the platform looks like. This is how this looks. And now Rick, go ahead and try to present. We would have discovered all this. So this was actually planned, and yeah, I'm gonna own that. Anyway, let me go ahead and present my deck, and we'll start working on this now that I feel scattered and a little confused. So we're going to talk about scenario-based training today. And it's one of those things I take very seriously because I've found in a lot of experience, having been trained as new hire or in other organizations, scenario-based training is one of the biggest failures. But it also has one of the greatest opportunities for accomplishing a lot. So I take it very seriously, and I've been lucky that I've worked in industries where they do very well at scenario-based training, but they really don't do well in a lot of other instructional design or learning and development. So that's military and law enforcement. Military does very well in delivery, in structure, in instructional design, following processes. Law enforcement, if you're wondering why law enforcement seems to be kind of screwed up, especially in the United States right now, it's because they live in a silo where they don't apply a lot of learning and development, science and processes and stuff. They are still thinking that they've invented training, but they do scenario-based training exceptionally well. Where it fails is how it's applied. There's a lot of talk about scenario-based training nowadays, especially on LinkedIn and in various organizations, but they don't really talk about what scenario-based training should look like. So this presentation is going to be about how creating scenario-based training should be used as a safe place to fail. Oftentimes we hear it used as role-playing. Role-playing is something kind of different. What it's used in corporate world isn't necessarily applied well, but where scenario-based training can really succeed is in new hire, and especially in lowering attrition and increasing retention. We want to increase retention. So real quick, my background, I've been in learning and development since 1994, before I actually knew that learning and development was a thing. I've been an instructor in law enforcement, firearms, and graphic design. I've also instructed in photography and in other types of industries. I've been adjunct faculty for criminal justice, graphic arts, and philosophy. I have been an instructional designer and learning strategist in multiple industries and in multiple opportunities and geographic locations. And I was a deputy sheriff for 10 years and an instructor in Virginia. I have a bachelor's in philosophy and a master's in criminal justice. In other words, I've been a lot of places, I've learned a lot of things, and it looks like I might have been scattered, but ultimately I've had a goal of just learning everything I possibly can and analyzing everything I can expose myself to. So the problem is attrition and retention. Statistically, the optimal amount of attrition that a company would go through is 10% or less. National average is 20%. Now, if that's across all industries, all organizations, all sizes of organizations. However, if you look at customer facing or customer contact type employment, you're looking at 30 to 45% attrition of new hire. That means that 30 to 45% of people are leaving within the first 45 days of their employment. But for the purpose of this presentation, we're going to just average the 30 to 45% to 37.5%. Now, I'm going to be focused a lot on customer contact type training, where we're talking about sales, we're talking about tech support, we're talking about just regular customer service. But scenario-based training can apply throughout all of the course of developing people within an organization, but it can also apply to any industry. We often hear that attrition and retention is a problem, but we don't often categorize it. We hear about percentages, we need to get this percentage, but let's take a look at what the actual costs are. Now, I've provided a participant guide for this presentation, and I go into a lot of detail. And the purpose of creating this participant guide with a lot of detail is to give you the opportunity to take this material back to your organizations and back to your decision makers, so you can say, this is what it costs. This is what the problem is, and here are the statistics. I just realized that my participant guide didn't include the references, so I will find a way of presenting those. I'll post the references in the chat at the end of this. So what is the actual cost? We know that we hear a lot about the cost of hiring. We hear a lot about the cost of retention. We hear a lot about percentages. But if we break it all down, to hire, if we look at, sorry, I'm still a little thrown off by my screw up at the beginning. The optimum percentage is 10% or lower for attrition. After 3 years, 69% of people stay in their jobs if they have a good onboarding experience. So we're using that percentage, 69% of people stay within 3 years. So we're going to assume that in a company of 100, every year they're going to lose 31 people. In order to replace those 31 people, we have to hire 50 in order to get 31 to stay, if we're using that 37.5% of attrition. The total cost of training 50 people over a year is $1.5 million. Now, I get that number from the salaries of everybody. So again, we're using customer contact numbers. The average salary of somebody in customer contact is $37,000 a year, which means it's about $4,272 over 45 days. So we multiply what their weekly salary is by 3 weeks of training, assuming 2 weeks of in-class, 1 week of on-the-job training. And we have to do that class 2 times a year of 25 people in order to get 31,000 people. That means that the total loss to attrition for the company in costs is $586,681. Now that's the cost of the 50 people that you hired. That's the cost to HR, which is about $4,000 per person. It's the cost of two instructors to provide that training to 25 people per class. But it's not including all of the other costs, like the cost to the business for actually hiring somebody. If y'all don't know, what you pay in employment tax, the company is matching that to pay for the honor of having you work for them. So if your pay is $50,000 a year and you're paying $15,000 a year in employment tax, your company is matching that $15,000 a year in employment tax as well. So that means, in essence, a company, between you and the company, you're paying to the government the cost of hiring another person. So that's $586,681 lost for the company in order to get 31 people back into the year. Yeah, I see that Anne's comment, that's if you can hire that many people at one time rather than in piecemeal. Absolutely. The attrition numbers would stay the same, but if you were able to get 25 people, like I've worked in a couple of call centers, but they would have classes of 30, knowing that they're planning on losing about half of them. And they wanted to fix the attrition, but they didn't know how. They weren't fixing the training. They were just like, we'll put all the pressure on the instructors to make sure that people stay. I've worked in several call centers where the pressure was put on the instructor, but there was nothing looked at what they were doing for training. So one of the things that we can assume from all this, though, is that if people are leaving within 45 days, the number one reason for people leaving is unrealistic expectations and workloads. So let's make an assumption on this, and it's a safe assumption. If the number one reason for people leaving is unrealistic expectations and workloads, and they've been leaving within 45 days of being hired, and the first 3 weeks are training, they've only worked in their role for another 3 weeks. So we can assume that the organization, the training, or the instructors failed to set expectations of what the workload would be and what their job entails. And if we failed to set the expectations, we also failed to train to expectations. Because once they finished those 3 weeks of training and they went into production and they were actually doing the job, they found that the job was not what they were trained to do. So this makes it a training issue. This loss of income makes it a training issue. So one of the ways we can fix that is scenario training can fix unrealistic expectations and workloads. We can fix the inadequate coaching, but we cannot fix we can fix the no clear path to growth, which are 3 of the top 4 reasons that people leave their jobs. The thing that scenario-based training can fix is unrealistic training expectations and workloads. So the way they do that is that scenario-based training brings realism to the job. If you're allowed to perform the analysis that you should be able to do as an instructional designer, and your analysis allows you to establish what the actual performance expectations are, while they're going through training, we should be training to what those expectations and what that workload should look like. The problem is that when we do 2 weeks of fire hosing people in training in a classroom, we might be doing some role-playing stuff, but we're not actually putting them in realistic work environments as part of their training. In every organization I've worked for, except for military, they go through a period of training, then they're immediately thrown into on-the-job training. But there's been no middle step. There's been no safe place to fail, a lab where they could fail and be okay before they get into on-the-job training. So if you're taking people who've just had 2 weeks of training and you're immediately putting them into on-the-job training, they haven't had time to synthesize the information. They haven't had time to practice the performance expectations. They haven't been given opportunity to practice the systems that they're going to be using as they're performing. So they're immediately going into on-the-job training, and they're overwhelmed with do everything all the time now on this one call with a real customer. That frustrates the employee, the trainee, or the participant, whatever you might call them. But it's also frustrating the customers. So now you're impacting the perception of the company that your customer has. And you're also frustrating supervisors and instructors and coaches, because you go through, you fuddle, you struggle, and you feel like you failed. And now the instructor has to build you up and criticize all the work you've done, but they also have 25 other people they have to work with. So by creating scenario-based training, you're bringing realism to it. You have to include time in your training where people can go through in this safe place to fail, where they get to work with the systems as they're communicating, as they're participating in the calls, and having the patience to do that, knowing that their job isn't at risk, and knowing that they have time to synthesize this information. So we need to be able to make mistakes without pressure. If you're going directly from training to live customers or any kind of live environment, and you make a mistake, you have tremendous pressure on you, because you either aren't hitting your stats that determine whether or not you're going to be kept at the end of on-the-job training, but you also have the pressure of other employees who are expecting you to pull your weight, and you have the pressure of instructors who are telling you to just work it out, but you haven't had that opportunity to bring it all together all at once. The other thing, by creating a safe place to fail, is it gives you opportunity to build data and build resiliency. Too often in 2 weeks of training, we train people to the result. We train them that if you do this thing, then you will have the result that we want you to have. But especially in a customer contact, and even more so with sales and with law enforcement, you might have performed perfectly well, but the result wasn't what they told you it would be. You failed. You failed to close the sale. You ended up in a fight. Anything that has customer contact, we have to change the idea that the result is the target. The win is the pressure to win has to be higher than the pressure. The pressure to win is higher than the pressure to perform well. The win is the result. We need to change the paradigm, and by doing that, we change that paradigm through creating scenario-based training. But we also create that by creating resiliency and putting them in scenarios where they're not going to succeed, because we're focused on their performance. If they're performing well, they may get the result that they want, or they may not. But we need to focus that it's the performance that matters. The result comes as you develop your skill set and as you develop that confidence. It also allows the opportunity to synthesize the information with less pressure. You have less pressure to get everything right on the first time with a customer who's impatient with having you fuddle around trying to figure out how to do things. Through scenario-based training, you're synthesizing all the things. You have to have the conversation. You have to utilize the software systems. You have to look up people's accounts. You have to maintain the conversation. You have to hear what the customer is saying. You have to overcome objections, all that stuff. You get all that in blocks of training in the regular 2-hour presentation, but then you're forced to do it all at once on the job training with live customers. If you don't provide that middle step where you can start developing that synthesized information, where you can start applying all the knowledge and skill sets all at the same time, then when you get into on-the-job training, you're setting up that unrealistic expectations, and they feel like there's a greater workload than there actually is. So to illustrate that, I'm going to talk about an opportunity that I had to do exactly that. I was working for a web technology company, and it had a product that trained customers on how to use WordPress which is a web-based technology. Excuse me. So the problem is that this group who were training people to use WordPress, they were losing customers and they were losing revenue. They were having people sign contracts for 6 months at $150 a month, and they were allowed to call at least once a day for 20-minute opportunities to learn how to do one thing in WordPress. Excuse me. But they were losing customers and they were losing revenue, and the team rarely ever grew above 15. So the other problem they had is that employees were slow to make their key performance indicators. It typically took people coming out of the original training 3 to 6 weeks to meet their KPIs. So we also found that the training wasn't based on actual tasks. The way they were training people is by having them do stuff that the managers and the engineers felt like people should know how to do in order to do this. Now, this training was 3 days of in-class training and then 2 days of on-the-job training. So what they had in the original 3-day training included history of WordPress. They started talking about, where did WordPress come from? How did Automattic first start? What was the situation that they needed that created WordPress? Then they were trained on instructing customers. Then they were trained on using customer service management system. Then the separate billing system. Then the WordPress site, how to build one, analyzing the website. I purposely had all these bullets, but all these things is what they were covering in 3 days. And then they would go directly into working with customers. So I did an analysis. I did a full task analysis where I sat with the different customer service reps and I watched what they did. I listened to their calls. I sat with their A performers, B performers, and C performers. But I also analyzed their cancellation data. I went through all their cancellation data to find out why people were canceling. And I found that expectations weren't being set with the customers and with the employees. The employees had no idea that they were supposed to be setting expectations with the customers. So the customers were expecting to be WordPress. They knew they signed up for a 6-month contract, but they expected to be doing everything they wanted to do in WordPress within a week. But we were telling the employees that it takes a long time, but we weren't telling them how. The other thing we found is that the performance wasn't being trained. All that stuff in that long list of bullets that I just provided had nothing to do with what they were actually doing. They weren't meeting the expectations because there was no performance that was being trained to. They were given lots of information. They were told how to do things, but they weren't told what the performance was actually supposed to look like. Also, there was no synthesis of performance tasks. They were giving them all the pieces of like, you're going to do this, you're going to do this, you're going to do this, and then you're going to tie it all together and you're on the job training. So they weren't given any opportunities for how to combine all that stuff into a call with a customer. And then there's no realistic performance in previous training. They didn't give them any kind of opportunities. They did role playing where the role play was, one participant talking to another participant about what their problem was, but it wasn't actually structured scenarios. So what I did is I changed it to a 5-day training solution. It was 5 days of training. And the first thing we did is we created an e-learning that people would take prior to coming to the class as an information of, this is what we expect you to do in this role, but this is what we expect you to do by setting these expectations with the customers that you're going to be working with. We told them it's going to take 6 months for you to be able to do everything you want to do in WordPress. In 20 minutes, you can only cover one topic. So we need you to do this one topic, and we need you to do homework before you contact us for the next topic. Instead of teaching them all 32,000 themes of WordPress, we analyzed WordPress, and there's 4 paradigms. If you can't find how to do it in this one type of theme, then there's 3 other ways it can be done. All 32,000 themes fit one of 4 paradigms. So it showed the customer service reps that they didn't have to know everything. They just needed to know where to find stuff. And we created this mantra that you seem like the expert because you find it 3 seconds before the customer actually finds it. We set expectations. We didn't expect them to know all the themes. We expected them to be able to find things quickly. And then we added scenario-based problem solving. We would have them actually build websites in each theme that represented those 4 different paradigms. It didn't matter what the theme was. It's like you're going to build a site using this paradigm, and this theme represents that paradigm. Once they got that experience, then we would have instructors or the A performers from the original team, or the supervisors or managers would call in with a question, and then they would have to instruct them. Now, we had to set up a lot of logistics for the scenario-based problem solving. We would give them a problem, say, here's the problem, solve it. And they would have to go through and solve it. And here's another problem, and solve that throughout these 4 different paradigms. And then we gave them scenario-based troubleshooting. Okay, I have this problem, I don't know where to find it. They would have to find the answer, and they would have to provide it. So before they even started talking with people, we had them doing the scenario-based problem solving. And then we would add them having to problem solve with people that were already doing the job who are not also participants in the class. The problem with using participants as role players is they also don't know what they're doing. So getting them to be able to focus on the problem and pull people towards where they need to answer is a lot more difficult. And then finally, we didn't have a final assessment of a 10 question multiple guess test. The scenario-based assessment was the assessment. We had set scenarios. Everybody would have to solve problems and work through those assessments. And as they finished, as they were able to complete their assessment, then they would go into on-the-job training. Well, the results were huge. Number one, I had to fight for this. I had to fight, I had to argue, and I was really out on a limb because nobody trusted me that I knew what I was doing. I wasn't a supervisor. I wasn't a director. I was just a lowly person who made pretty slide decks. So what do I know about getting people to perform correctly? So this was the first time I was able to actually apply the entire instructional design process to the training. But this was also the first time that scenario-based training was introduced to any training in this 5,000 person company across 4 continents. The results, though, were KPIs were now met within 3 to 5 days. Instead of 3 to 6 weeks, they were hitting KPIs within 3 to 5 days. The employee attrition, which previously was equal to what we had talked about, they were losing 37.5% of their people within the first 45 days. We dropped attrition down to 2%. Customer attrition dropped to 5%, where before it was 50%. They were losing 50% of their customers within the first 30 days after signing a contract. The team grew from 15 to 100 in 2 years. And because of the enormous growth of people staying for those full 6 months, they had plans of growing the team to 300 employees. All because we did the analysis, but we made it performance-centric, and we added scenario-based training where before people actually started talking to a live customer, they went through scenarios where they had to solve problems, walk through training people, and do that with instructors, supervisors, or other A performers. It was enormous. But here's the kicker. Everyone was super excited about the success of this. I still had to fight every time to add scenario-based training, every single time. So how do you create a safe place to fail? What is a safe place to fail? You're creating reality. You're creating consistency, and you're creating continuity to get accountability. Creating scenarios is making it as realistic as possible. You're creating scenarios that aren't just a paragraph in your instructor guide that says, hey, you're going to do this role play scenario where get two participants, have one person have sales problems and have the other person try to overcome those objections. That's not reality. You want the best training is as close to the reality of what their performance will be as possible. In law enforcement, that means you're working with actors who know how to run domestics. In sales, you're working with people who know what sales are like, but they're not actually also participants. In the military, when we did scenarios, it was a week-long training experience where they created scenarios and situations where they had to control the environment. They had to interact with other people in different branches of the military service. They had to work with other military personnel in other countries. We made it as realistic as possible. It means that there's a lot of logistics involved. That means you need to have offices. If you're doing sales, if you're doing telemarketing sales, you need to have the computers, the systems, and the office and the telephones that they would be using when they get on the floor. If you're dealing with HR issues, you need to have realistic situations where that comes up. Where do you get these? For like the sales training, and part of the participant guide that I've provided you, I have samples of scenarios and role player cards I've created. In the PG that I've shared with you, there are 6 of 30 role player cards I created for a travel sales company. I listened to over 100 calls and I found 30 that matched the criteria I was looking for. Out of that 30, the percentage of sales versus rejections is equal to what the company's statistics were, because I want the reality. I want them to have resiliency. That lack of expectations, the work didn't meet expectations. When you're training people overcome objections and you're going to get the sale, that doesn't happen in real life. You have to have them fail and not lose confidence in themselves and know that it's the performance that you're focused on. The sales will come. But you also have to have consistency. The consistency means you have to have everything documented and structured. In order to have the consistency, you have to have templates. You have to have control documents. You have to have role player cards, and you have to have rubrics, and you have to have a maintenance schedule where you can revise everything. Now, templates is so that all the documentation looks the same, so that no matter who looks at it, if you have different people, different role players coming into your training, they need to be able to deliver the same experience. So you have that consistency between iterations of training and your personnel. You need to have control documents. The location that the scenario-based training is going to occur. Who the people are that's going to monitor the participant, the instructor that will monitor the participant, the instructor who's going to pay attention to the role player and the participant to make sure that they're following the scenario correctly. You also have to know what materials you need. You have to have your software systems. You have to have the accounts you're going to use, the dummy accounts you're going to use in the software systems. You have to have control documents that set up everything. And then your role player cards. You can't have role players just improv everything. So at the bottom of that participant guide, you're going to see that I include things like the name, a picture of the person. I have what their background is, what's going on during the call, what their affect is. Are they happy? Are they cold? Are they angry? And then I have prompts, things that I want things that were taken from the call that required the participant to respond specifically. And then there are conversation pieces, answers that they're already going to have. If the participant asks you this question, here's your answer. If they don't ask this question or respond correctly, this is what you say. By controlling that, you're providing a more realistic experience, but you're also creating consistency. And you need that consistency so you can get accurate data that you can use for future analysis, but also consistency gives you continuity. That means that everybody's being trained the same between participants, but everyone's being trained the same between iterations of training also. you have to have a continuity. You cannot have consistency. You cannot have continuity. And I'm sorry, you have to have consistency and you have to have continuity, or you cannot have accountability. Now, businesses are very good at holding people accountable, very good at firing people because they don't meet statistics, very good at blaming people for not performing the jobs that they're supposed to do. But if we don't have the consistency and the continuity, we really shouldn't be holding people accountable. Without having consistency in your documentation and in your role players, you can't get that continuity, but then you don't really know what you're holding people accountable to. Just like I said, we've been holding people accountable to results without providing them the performance that they need in order to get those results. So the performance needs to be the focus. The results are just the incentive of performing well. So that's what I'm stopping with right there. The way you design scenarios is very wide and different. I strongly suggest you download my participant guide, because my participant guide provides samples of those role player cards, and it provides explanations of those role player cards. But also I have a sample of a scenario it's about 9 pages of a scenario I designed for assessing law enforcement response to a domestic. Because it's more complex, it needs more control documentation, but it also has the role player cards, and I included a rubric of how you would evaluate that. One of the things I didn't cover too deeply was the rubric. If you're going to do scenario-based training, you have to have a rubric. Otherwise, everything that you're assessing, everything that you're evaluating is completely subjective. You have to have a rubric so that you know that people are hitting the level of competency that you want to see in their performance, and it's not entirely based off of you. The rubric is what establishes continuity and consistency between instructors and between iterations of training. So I'm going to stop here and give you all opportunities to ask questions. I think we have about 15 minutes left. And yeah. Actually, you can ask questions in the actual chat, because I can't see the chat feature. I'm sorry, the question feature on the stage.
Just seeing if we've got anything come in on the Q&A for you. Loads of comments. Nothing on the Q&A though at this point.
Maybe it'd be helpful if I shared my the role player cards. Would that be useful?
No, I'd like to see them.
Okay. I'll go ahead and share the participant guide too.
Oh, there we go.
All right, so I said that I created role player cards for sales. So the way we structured it for the sales and the customer service stuff, the scenario, since we're not having to worry about physical safety, we're not having to worry about traveling between locations in order to do this training, I can put all of the logistical information in the instructor guide. So the instructor guide has the setup, the logistics. Use room 2A, which has already been set up with the computer systems, and then 2C is where the role players for the sales will go. And these are the phone numbers that you need to use in order to call into room 2A. And then the role players are given this card. So the role player, his name is Red. The facts are Red travels once or twice a year. He barely leaves the United States. He has a membership number. His affect, he's quiet, doesn't give a lot of information. Ultimately, what is the result? He's going to refuse the sale. Then the flip side of that role player card are, here's the answers that he would give. So if the agent says something about quarterly specials, when are those 4 days? He's going to ask questions. Now, all these came from actual calls. So I didn't have to make anything up. I didn't have to invent stories. I can, if I need to, when I write more complex scenarios. But this is what I do. I have 30 of these so that so you have a variety of opportunities. I give an idea of how long the call should last, about 10 minutes. And then I just have different pieces of information. So whoever the role players are can take these role player cards, and they have information that's structured. Now you want to train your role players also so that they don't go off the charts. They don't improv and make things more complicated than they need to, because you want people to have an experience that's going to be close to the realistic experience they're going to have when they're doing the job. So you want to have your role players be able to improv enough to be able to guide people to where they need to be. That's another purpose for these prompts. But you also want to give them enough flexibility that if something happens that's not on the role player card, they have enough background information, they have enough behavior information, they know how to say things in order to draw it back to what that card should be. So in the participant guide that we've shared with you are 6 examples of this, and they get increasingly longer calls. You can have fun with it. Janis Joplin, I was listening to that on iTunes when I was preparing these. I decided she needed to be, her music is okay, but she needs to be eternalized in sales training for this travel company. And so she has her own role player card. But the call is an actual call. And the person on the call reminded me of interviews of Janis Joplin. So I wanted to bring her into it to a degree as well. So those are the role player cards that I created. They're very easy to navigate. But after you're done with the scenario-based training and you're doing the debrief of how training went, if you need to adapt the role player cards, then you do that for the next iteration of training. And you keep a change log of what was changed so that if you see a change in your data, you're able to associate it with, was it because we changed role player cards, or was it something else? So then there's the domestic violent call evaluation. This has a lot more information because there are fake firearms involved that shoot 6mm pellets called airsoft guns. And so we have to have safety officers. The deputies are traveling from one location in their vehicles to another location. We have to have somebody that's going to make sure that they're not carrying any real weapons with them. We have a safety officer inside. We have 2 role players that are doing specific things. And so we have to account for a lot of stuff. Anything that you don't account for becomes a loss of control within the training itself, and you can't allow for that to happen. We have a debrief where we bring all the deputies together. We give them an idea of this is what we're going to do. This is how it's going to work. And I don't have all the role player cards in here because I wanted to shorten the document, but there's actually 6 role player cards for here. One for each husband, and because there's 2 scenarios that they'd be participating in. In the first scenario, there's nothing to worry about. It's just an angry person, 2 angry people going on. In the second scenario, it's set 6 months later. They show up, it's the same wife, it's a different boyfriend. The purpose of this scenario was to see who people were going to focus on. In the first scenario, the husband was 5'6", like 113 pounds, hardly a threat. The second scenario, they're divorced. The boyfriend's in the house now, and he's 6'3", bald, and 300 pounds of hard muscle. Were they going to get so sucked in on this guy who is going to be in a defensive posture all the time that they lose track of the wife? And if they do, the wife disappears down the hall, retrieves an airsoft gun, comes back up, and we tell them in the role player card, bring the weapon up, hold for 3 seconds. After 3 seconds, shoot the boyfriend, then shoot the cop. If the deputy is doing everything right, they never get to that. One of the things I failed to mention is that every scenario is winnable. What winnable is differs. Now, winnable in this situation is they never have to draw a firearm. if they do have to draw the firearm, they engage the target. This assessment had, out of 10 cops, 5 were shot, 2 did not return fire at all. That was a serious issue that that squad's leadership was concerned about. But then I also have an example of the rubric of what superior performance would be. We were looking for the approach, communication, situational awareness, and scene control. And we were only evaluating on 3 levels: superior, satisfactory, and unsatisfactory. I could do a whole other presentation on building rubrics. That's something I do in my ID for trainers and educators course. But you have to have rubrics that actually say things. Your rubric can't be satisfactory is they do this thing, and then superior is they do it really well, and inferior is they don't do it at all. You actually have to address what that performance would look like. Whoa, that scanned a lot faster than I expected. So, for instance, for communication, satisfactory communication, this is the things that they did not, and they, this is the unsatisfactory. They did not request search location and call history before arrival. In satisfactory, they requested search location and call history before arrival. But superior is they also asked additional questions. So make sure you download this PG so you have access to this. This is a template I actually provide, and I was thinking about providing it for this presentation. I don't know if Tom is able to email everyone who's participated in this, the template I use for this scenario, but you can build your own templates for role player cards.
Sure thing. Yeah, we can include that. That's super easy. Couple of quick questions that have come in just before we wrap up. Then we have sharing those would be great. What tool do you use to create your simulations?
Okay, if you're talking about the role player cards and such, I use Microsoft Word or InDesign, Adobe InDesign. These document the role player cards for this for the sales training was done in Adobe InDesign. For the law enforcement, it was done in Microsoft Word, and I built it using tables in a template.
Brilliant. And the only other one was, I think, someone asking about the references, but I think you're going to make those available at some point after the session.
Yeah, I can pull those up real quick if you like.
Oh, but yeah, we can drop them in the chat and make sure they're available. Fantastic.
I apologize if I seem a little discombobulated or disorganized. I just this is a brand new presentation. Y'all were my guinea pigs. I appreciate your patience.
Well, I thought that was really fantastic, actually. And there's loads to take away there. We were kind of discussing just before you went live. I know, kind of like the kind of this exact topic, and about how the practical side of this so often gets overlooked, and all the little details that we do need to do to make this stuff really work. So I thought that was absolutely full of really, really useful stuff, actually. So thank you for coming and sharing.
Apparently, I can't comment, so I won't be able to paste it in there.
Oh, right. Yeah, if you drop it in the private chat, I'll drop it straight in now.
Okay.
Collect that copy.
I apologize. I didn't include my references in my participant guide. Like I said, can't let this pursuit of perfection get in the way of great. And
absolutely,
clearly, I'm not perfect. I can't even say perfectly.
Well, but as we would say, perfect people are boring. That's the thing. No
one. I'm super excited.
This is why Superman is such a boring read. Like, he can do everything. Oh well, never mind. Anyway, thank you so much for your session. Brilliant stuff. Thank you everyone in the audience for tuning in. And this is the end of day 2. We now have just one day left of IDTX 2023, but we do have a lot of really fantastic sessions coming up. I think tomorrow it's a total of My system no longer tells me how many sessions are going. That's marvelous. But I want to say it's about 13, 14 sessions. And tomorrow's end of day keynote is from Kara North. So lots to look forward to across the day. Thanks all once again, and we shall see you later.
Bye, y'all.